everyone. Welcome to the Amplitude of Tech podcast. I'm Shawn, Chief Marketing Officer of Amplix. Today, I spoke to Michael Smith of Congruity 360. I didn't think he could do it, but he made the topic of data and data readiness sexy. If you don't believe me, listen to the podcast and see what you think. I enjoyed this one. I think you will too. All right, Michael Smith, thank you for joining the podcast today.
Pleasure's mine.
It's a tough name to pronounce. I've been practicing it all morning. I think I got it right. Is that right?
Yeah, mom and dad pulled out all the stops. My middle name is Joe, so.
Perfect. All right. So let's start off with just, not a commercial, but if you want to give us the quick 30,000 foot overview of what Congruity 360 does.
Yeah, Congruity 360 focuses on unstructured data management. And really what we're looking at is helping our customers with their number one unstructured data management problems and the issues that occur from having large amounts of data, not having in place the ability to manage it properly, and what those problems, generate from a security perspective, from a data management, from a cost perspective, from moving it into AI models, which happens to be the number one problem that organizations face when they're trying to launch AI projects, is just having the right data. So we've really focused in on a couple of key aspects: putting the right processes in place to match the size and the problems that you're having with it. So it's not a kind of a one size fits all. You run everything through the same process. We have multiple steps, and therefore we kind of match up the right process to manage the data more efficiently and do the process more efficiently.
It's interesting that we're in a world now where a company like yours needs to exist. If you went back, 10, 20 years, their businesses had data, right? But unstructured data was not inherently a problem. It was maybe a mess, and maybe it would cost a little bit of extra money in terms of infrastructure costs to host all that data. But here we are, we're living in a data economy. Data probably could be argued as most enterprises' most valuable asset. Would you agree?
It's funny you should say that. I looked at some historical research analysis, and 15 years ago, you're right, it didn't even, when they asked CEOs what the most important assets are within the organization, data didn't even get on the list. And now you'd see that right behind, human resources and finances, data is number 3 on the list, or number 2. Depends on which industry you're in. So it really has moved up in importance. I think people are starting to understand and take note. And certainly as we're moving into a more AI-centric competitive environment, folks are looking to get advantages and take advantage of their data sources and start using them and treating them as assets. So it's fortunate for us and our industry that people are doing that. And I think you're also starting to see it in some of the frameworks out there. NIST is one of the frameworks that we really follow a lot. And the NIST framework, for example, for AI and also for cybersecurity, have moved data management into the forefront. So it's all good for us, I think.
What isn't data? I think intuitively everybody knows what is data or what data is, but what isn't data? Because in today's world, in today's environment, we're collecting all this data, all these different inputs, all these engagement points and interaction points with the business and the business's digital footprint. And there's interactions happening through the contact center, and contact centers now are not just people on the phone, but they're chat bots and their SMS messages. There's so many different touch points, and there's so many different, internal processes and workflows, and there's so many human beings, but now there's also AI agents. And so what isn't data? It feels like everything is data, right?
Well, yeah, I think it is, from a business perspective. I mean, even conversations you and I having, it's data. We're transmitting data back and forth. So when you think about it, human interaction is all about transmitting data to one another. So it can be visual, it can be oral, it can be written, all of that is data. But from a data management perspective, there's really 2 types of data. There's 2 main types of data. There's unstructured data and there's structured data. And your structured data is going to be your databases and your systems that are cranking out data that is organized into standard, database kind of organizations. Unstructured data is all the other. Now, originally, businesses all focused in on the importance of their structured data. Why? Invested heavily in the applications, whether, as you say, it's ERP systems or whether it's their financial systems. Taking a look at that was all run on structured data. But now, especially the communication capabilities and how we interact as human beings has been more on the unstructured data management side. So there's a lot of information that's captured on the unstructured data side, and that growth has been unbelievable. Unstructured data now accounts for about 85% of the data that enterprises create on a daily basis. So when you have 85% to 90% of your data is unstructured data, and where it's stored, how it's stored, who accesses it, it all becomes really important relative to how a business operates.
I want to take a slight tangent for a second, but are you familiar with the work of Antonio Damasio?
I can't say that I am familiar with Antonio.
So he's a neuroscientist that has done groundbreaking work on emotions. So the name of his most popular book is called Descartes' Error. And the thesis of the book is that, Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am." And what he's saying is basically, "I feel, therefore I am." And the thesis is that emotions are part of the decision-making process. So even when you think about making rational, analytical, logical thoughts, emotions neurologically are a big part of the process of that decision-making. And you don't know it. It's not emotion in the sense that you're cognizant of that feeling that you're having. It's more an actual logical process. But what I love about what you're saying is you're putting the human at the center of the data conversation, which I think is so important. So many businesses, especially in a B2B environment, they don't really think in human terms necessarily. And so what that makes me think about is the data that comes from like sentiment analysis in a contact center, for example. Right? And it's like, what are we actually measuring there? And what can we do with that data? And I think what you're saying is that there's gold in a lot of this unstructured data, and almost all of the data that we have is actually unstructured. So I guess that's a really long roundabout, probably snobby way of getting to the question of what can we do with all this unstructured data? Is it usable?
Of course, it's usable, but it's just like mining. When you think about mining for minerals, how much of that deposit is concentrated in one area and how much is it spread out all over the place? And speaking of human nature, I always say that human beings have part squirrel DNA in them because they have a tendency to take data and store it wherever they are and around it in multiple copies. So data sprawl becomes an incredibly important issue to deal with when you start talking about managing data efficiently. So the ability to, track data wherever it goes, be able to catalog it, to have the capacity to understand what your data sources are, and then winnow it down. It's always about culling the data sets down to, what's relevant to the project that you're working on, what you're trying to accomplish as a business, what are your business goals. So whether it's, putting together AI models or just making your business more efficient, is understanding what the goals are and then matching the data sources and the data elements to that and making sure that you've got an efficient setup to find that data quickly, easily, and make it still at the same time available to everybody.
So since we have part squirrel DNA, I think one of the things that squirrels do, just to carry your analogy a little bit further, is they take their acorns and they stash them in all these different places, right? And maybe there's logic to where they put it, maybe there's not logic to where they put it. But what we do know is that they don't always go back and get 100% of the things that they squirrel away. So how do enterprises manage individual people and maybe broken down processes that don't put data in a usable or findable or easy place?
Well, I think you've nailed the probably the number one issue and problem out there, and from data sprawl and data growth and uncontrolled data growth. And that's the issue around rot which stands for redundant, obsolete, and trivial data. And the other thing is, you have turnovers. Think about, the standard enterprise in a business. You have people that work there for a number of years and then they leave the company. Almost, I'd say 90% of the time, that data becomes unmanaged. It's just sitting there. And it's sitting out on file shares. It's sitting in SharePoint. It's sitting in Box. It's sitting all over the place. Why? It's not anybody's problem, right? It's just, that person's no longer here, out of sight, out of mind. That data sits there. And over the years, you've got huge amounts of data sets that are completely unmanaged. And when that happens, you've got, once again, you could have some really important information that's in there from a, business operational standpoint, and also from a governance perspective, and also from a risk perspective. A lot of those files, include PII. It also includes certainly IP in some instances. So the fact that that's spread out, it's unmanaged, it becomes orphan data. Those things really don't do the business any good. So the ability to kind of organize that data and make an assessment of that data quickly, because once again, the sheer volumes of data is quite staggering. And the problem, since it hasn't been addressed in years, and sometimes never in an organization, that culling process can be painful. Putting together a good tool set to attack the problem efficiently, handle large amounts of data, take the low-hanging fruit, take the easy wins, the ones that you can identify quickly and move on, is always the best practice to start the process.
So, what is the operational impact to the business in having all this data sprawl? I think we're kind of alluding to the opportunity cost, right? There's an opportunity
Mm-hmm.
cost of having this data,
Sure.
and certainly not being able to access that data in any kind of systematic way, right? But there's got to be real costs in terms of storage at the starting point, right? But
Sure.
even costs in terms of risk. So, talk to me about that.
Yeah, we typically go in and start doing assessments for companies of their data. We do data assessments. We go in and take a look at their data from multiple different viewpoints. The first one is from infrastructure optimization and understanding that. And what goes into that? Well, you certainly have the underlying storage costs and all the associated costs with storage, but you also have backup costs. You also have network costs. You also have just power and cooling, all the things that go into, maintaining a data center, or, just maintaining a server, comes into play. The other piece of the puzzle is that typically everybody, leaves it on their tier one storage and they're backing it up. And you ask yourself, when you start doing an analysis of it, and for a while I've worked in the area of enterprise backup. Most of that data is over, 2, 3, 4, 7, 10 years. Why are you backing up data that doesn't change? Number one, the main reason why you're backing up data is to have version controls, to be able to take a look at the data and go recover. And if you have data that's over 2 years old, you're only going to have one version of the data. Was just the way backups work. So why are you backing that data up? Better off if you move it to a lower cost archive tier that has built-in availability, higher availability. You're going to have better protection of the data. It's going to be off your tier one storage. You've got the ability to call that data back if you need it. So no one can complain that, you're taking my data away. You're just moving it into a more intelligently managed environment. So that's one side of the coin. From a risk perspective, as I mentioned before, let's just talk about orphan data. One of the things that happens during cyber attacks is the criminals look for unmanaged data sources. Why? They can go in and adopt the SIDS and mask themselves to then go ahead and find other sources of data within the organization. Sort of like a mole. Once they get inside of it, then they make it and use it as an identification as they go through the system. So identifying orphan data and things from a security perspective is certainly key. And one of the other things that we also point out is that if you're leaving these things on your tier one storage, it's on your network, it's on your main network. And usually these have open read, write, and access permissions and what have you. So it's available, it's sitting there, it's vulnerable. Oftentimes this data includes PII all kinds of information. We find data sets where there's a list of 20,000 security numbers on it in one file, right? All of that stuff doesn't belong on your production environment. It doesn't belong in that environment. It belongs in a protected environment. Pull it off to the side where there's no access points to it and move it off until you can manage it more efficiently and take it off. So what happens is by just going in through and doing basic best practices approach to data hygiene and moving that off of your production environment, you're able to shrink your attack surface, which is really when you'll start talking to cyber analysts and start talking about folks who are insuring companies from cyber attacks. Attack surface is a big determination on what your insurance rates are going to be. So going in and being able to reduce that attack surface, put it into a gapped environment where access is completely limited, is going to reduce that cyber attack profile dramatically.
Isn't that so interesting? Because I have not heard anyone talk about data being part of the attack surface, right? And that's been one of the interesting things in my career to see from a cybersecurity perspective is how the surface area of risk, right, has grown exponentially. And we saw it so much, during the pandemic where people left the office, right? And so the perimeter of the enterprise network all of a sudden is exploding exponentially because you've got all these individuals going home, and that just opens up a whole other factor of risk. Now, that being exponential because you're taking one office that had hundreds or thousands of employees and you're multiplying that risk by that number.
Right.
Now we're talking about data, and data is a much bigger set than employees, right? So that surface area and that risk factor must be growing by orders and orders of magnitude.
Absolutely. You see the research out there on how fast unstructured data is growing. And I've seen recent estimates where data is tripling over, 4-year period. So with that kind of growth, you can imagine, and once again, you think about all the new applications, sharing applications, as new applications pop up, they all have their applications and their storage areas. So each one becomes, a silo of information. And, that information, they all have different protection levels. They all have different access controls and things in them. So there are gaps that show up as far as being able to access that information. So I think, being able to identify, early on where critical information is and taking steps to secure it. And then once again, if you have multiple copies of the same data, you're just asking for trouble, right? So reduce the number of copies that you have, get it down to, the minimum, and you're going to really dramatically change your attack surface and your cyber vulnerability profile.
And not only that, but to your point about the social security numbers, right? You're also increasing the impact that a breach could have by having all this data sitting around and accessible to bad actors.
A- Absolutely. Once again, most early on in the whole concept of cyber resiliency and cyber attack defense, it was all focused in on at the firewall, right? You're building a wall around the organization. You're putting up your protections against that, but you're forgetting the number one issue and the number one thing isn't about just getting through your defenses. It's about getting access to the data because that's where the value is. If you look at what a cyber attack represents, they're going to hold your data hostage, right? And that's what their goal is. So if you understand that instead of just building up and spending all this time building a great wall, so to speak, around your data and spending all your money and time and energy and effort on building that, I think there are more efficient ways to really shrink the size of the wall and really where you're going to spend the extra dollars and cents on security on that key data area and moving that off. So, those systems are perfect, but it's just logical to take what is considered the most important data and put it into the highest security levels that you have.
Yeah, and building that wall, I mean, you could build the biggest wall out there, but there's still an open back door, which is the human beings that work for your
Mm-hmm.
company and that are part of your supply
Mm-hmm.
chain. And that's always going to be your biggest risk factor because humans make mistakes and humans fall for things. And
Sure.
so bad actors are able to get in through human beings. So while you do need to focus on your defenses, I think you also have to focus on the mitigation of an incident happening.
Mm-hmm.
I would assume, maybe you'll agree with me, that the more data that you have, the more complex your recovery is going to be in the case of, say, ransomware, and you're trying to restore your data so you can get back into business. The more data you have, the more failure points, the more challenge.
Right. And let's face it, whether it's backup or whether it's restoration, you've got cycles. And I think by going through and defining what's critical information, you can triage and put what data needs to be restored first. What's the most relevant, important, highest value to the organization. So thereby determining that you can set up a restoration process that if you do come under attack and things are going, what gets restored first is going to be the most mission critical data to you. And so out of unstructured data, that is more difficult than, as I said before, when you start talking about ERP systems, it's pretty defined, you know what it is. And, you're going to do that on the structured data side, but unstructured has been relatively more difficult, but it just requires, once again, identifying and declaring by classifying that data as being important, tagging it, and making sure that you've got the systems in place to find it and bring it back as quickly as possible.
So everything that we're talking about, we're dancing around, I think, the solution, which is data minimization, right? So what does it mean to minimize your data in this context?
Yeah, I think you're going to start seeing. I've heard through the grapevine that some of the research analysts, that's going to be one of the key areas that they're talking about here in 2026 is around data minimization and the benefits of data minimization. And having been in the data side of the field for 10 years plus, it's refreshing to hear that because said when you've got the just crazy growth of data and most of it being unmanaged, it just leads to really bad issues and problems. So minimizing data, it just requires a different mindset. It requires, once again, doing that assessment, understanding the value of the data and getting rid of the chaff. And that's just, good data hygiene.
So we had a little pre-podcast planning session, and you introduced this idea to me, and the tension that's been living in my mind ever since is uh you used the term rot before, right? So the T in rot is trivial data.
Mm-hmm.
And what I'm struggling with a little bit is like we said, 15 years ago we didn't know how important data was going to be. 5 years ago, we didn't know that AI was going to be as capable as it is today. Use cases are growing and changing every day. We don't know what tomorrow is going to bring, let alone 3 years from now. So, my
Mm-hmm.
question kind of revolves around how do you know it's trivial versus you just don't know what the use case is going to be for it in the future? Like, you could look at your data and you could say, this data here has a clear business use. This has a legal use. This has a compliance requirement, but the rest of it that isn't clear today, maybe future opportunity that we're losing by minimizing the data.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And there's the science portion of it and there's the art of it, right? And you mentioned before, as we started talking about, that the human aspects of things become more important as we go through, especially now that you're trying to use AI to mimic what the human mind is doing, that becomes important. But there are some certain things that you can do to start the process. And you're right, you're never going to be 100% accurate or perfect, but there are steps that you can take that to help you manage that process. And what do I mean? Just by taking a look at metadata, you're able to make some key decisions about data. And when we start talking about trivial, we go through with our customers and take a look at, well, what applications are key to your business right now? And what applications do you think in the future will be? And understand that. And there are certain ones that you can agree upon. There are certain applications, number one, that aren't supported anymore, right? So you can't even, the data is sitting there and you can't even use it because the application, you don't even have the applications anymore. So just being able to go through and identify applications that are no longer supported or what have you, or not relevant to the business. So you can go through using different pieces of the puzzle there. There's one data scientist I talked to before that said he starts every one of his projects taking a look at the DNA of his data, and that's the metadata. So I found that to be a very compelling analogy there because, that's what we preach is taking a look at the metadata from a cataloging and understanding of provenance of the data. You can make certain determinations from that and be able to start the process. The rest of it requires, contextual analysis. So actually going in and taking a look at the data and starting to find and identify what the key things are. But as you say, that is sitting down and having a conversation with the organization to find out, and agree upon. And that's not always the easiest thing, but as I said, you can certainly start the process and take some big chunks and big bites out of data just by doing that cataloging and identification of the data through a metadata analysis. So that'd be my suggestion as a first step.
I think we touched on this briefly, but if we could spend a little bit more time on it, the process of minimizing your data does have a cost implication in a positive way, right? So can you talk about cost as a forcing function of minimizing your data or as a benefit and outcome of minimizing your data?
Yeah, it's funny. Oftentimes we'll get pulled into projects and it will be certain stakeholders within the organization. So let's just say we're going into a specific piece and there might be a merger or acquisition coming in, right? And they're looking at the new company and they're trying to determine, what stuff are they going to bring over, what stuff are they going to leave behind and what have you. But going through a discussion with the customer to identify, those pieces of the data, the benefits of doing that cleanup and things before you bring it in often pay for the entire project itself, the cost savings. So what we typically do is go in, do a quick analysis, make some suggestions, and based upon those suggestions, model out what the potential cost savings would be on that from an infrastructure cost perspective, but also say, from a cybersecurity perspective, if we shrink the attack surface, those kinds of things. So there's really, a good methodology to put into taking a look at a project and not only leveraging it for, once again, the actual project itself, what it can do as far as financing, getting cost savings, getting some efficiencies, scales of efficiencies. And then, it's usually what you do in those situations is then look for the next project. And you typically find when you start a project like that, other folks within the organization say, well, can't you do that for my division over here? Can't you do that for my department over here? Can't you do that? So consequently, we typically, once we get into an organization and start cleaning up the data, it becomes word of mouth within the organization comes through and people start taking a look at it.
I also wanted to ask about the outcomes with AI because I think intuitively, probably because the way that most of the public has been introduced to AI is through large language models. And the implication is that more data is better in that kind of scenario, right? You train it, you end up getting a better understanding of how humans talk and interact and what they mean and what the intentions are. But famously right now we're seeing a pilot to scale gap, right? A lot of people are talking about the challenges of going through a small pilot and actually having that produce an ROI, but also just the intended result, whatever the intended result
Mm-hmm.
may have been.
Sure.
And I think we're finding that for these discrete functions that AI is being leveraged for, more data is not necessarily better, and that to get better outcomes, you may need to have less data.
I would argue that more data is not what you want to do. I would argue that the right data is what you want. You want a representative data set, number one, because when you think about it, more data, I start talking about rot. I start talking about, duplicate copies. What does that do to your model? Right? It's going to give you bad results because guess what? You're going to have something that's overweighted within the model because you've got duplicates or you've got data that's outside the range of what you're looking for. So um, I would I would say, the number one thing is having the right data. And then the other issues when you start talking about large language models and other things such as that, you start talking about, okay, what information am I putting in there? Is there PII? Is there sensitive information? Well, you're putting it in a large language model. You just opened Pandora's box, right? It's now been shared. It's in the model somewhere. You've got to be careful. And as I said, the number one problem is we did a survey of it was through an organization that surveyed 600 enterprises worldwide and surveying their CIOs and CISOs. And the number one issue and problem they had with their AI implementations was just getting data, the right data into the model. The cost involved, there's a reason why NVIDIA is the most valuable company in the world is guess what? People are spending a lot of money on processing data. And if you're wasting it by putting large amounts of bad data in there, shame on you. You've got to know what it is. So I think a lot of the data scientists that are working on projects, they get it pretty much. So it's folks that are beginning to dabble into it and looking at it from a just dabbling in it perspective. They're going to stub their toes a lot. So I highly recommend that spend a few more bucks on the upside of cleansing that data and getting the right data in there. It's going to serve you so much better on the outcomes that you get on the back end.
Is this also a hedge against future operating costs for AI initiatives in the sense that, you mentioned NVIDIA, these chips, they're not going to last forever, right? They're going to be deprecated
Mm-hmm.
in 3 years, or there's better chips that are coming out, right? And so
Sure.
um, that's a significant cost that these data centers or enterprises that are doing it on their own are going to incur to get to the next chip, to realize the next performance power or level, because that's going to be necessary, because as you stated before, data growth is exponential, right? It's just spinning out of control. So isn't it a fair statement to say that the the less data that you're processing now and the better your discipline about using data to process in the future, the less your costs are going to increase over time?
Absolutely. Cost, time to value. If your models are running shorter, you're going to see results much faster. So as I said, the costs are minimal on what you're going to spend on cleaning up versus what you're going to spend on the back end. Right. So it makes a lot of sense to spend a little bit of time, get some data cleansing going on, get some best practices approach to making sure your data is organized. Other advantages when you start getting into the finer points and taking a look at the data and tagging that data with classification context around that data. So as you're feeding it into the model, you're also helping the model by giving it some context around that. There's all these advantages that can happen through just proper prep, one-on-one of just getting the data ready.
Now, to drift away from the things that the enterprise has agency over themselves necessarily, and kind of talk about maybe market conditions or risk inherent to the market, what are the risks of public model data sharing when it comes to AI?
Once again, once it's public shared, it's available to everybody. So if all of a sudden you put into a large language model personal information or sensitive information, that's out there. You have no control over it. It's gone. It's as if you went out to the world and said, here's this data, go for it. So you got to be careful. You got to be careful. And I can tell you, for many years I started off on Wall Street. Um, the large players were deathly afraid of going into any AI models because they knew that the amounts of sensitive data that they had that they just couldn't allow out, into a large language model or anything of those, you know, just stop them in their tracks. So there are ways of managing that. And as I said, it's going through cleaning up that data where you have to, uh, you know, take that data out of the pool or do some changes to that data before you implement it. It's well worth it. I guarantee you'll spend a lot less problems, money, have less problems, and certainly from a litigation and liability perspective, dramatically reduce your exposure.
How can minimizing data affect how the individual employees or people that access that data's potential for creating problem and leaking data through these public models?
Well, there are multiple ways of doing that. We have one customer I'm thinking of as an example. All of their personal data for each one of their employees, they get a final say on, um, how that data is being handled and managed. So we have automated policies that go through and take a look at it and suggest that, but they get a sign off on that. And so they can say yes or no. But we then also cleanse the data afterwards. Truly, it's a matter of making sure that everybody becomes a data steward and under that sense, right? So you're trying to put together a culture within an organization and putting in place, checks and balances and putting in place that type of structure really goes a long way because if everybody in the organization is taking, you know, uh, taking responsibility for their own data, it it just works in the ethos for the organization, and people will attack the problem or deal with the problems differently.
Do you have any tips for how to impact the culture in that way and make good stewardship of the business's data, the client's data part of the culture? Because it's often hard to get everyone in the boat rowing in the same direction. And I found with other types of projects and implementations, a lot of it is understanding the why and what the impacts are and relating it in a way like, in sales and in marketing, right? The first thing they teach you is your language needs to be oriented around the question that the customer or the client is asking themselves, which is, what's in it
Right.
for me? Why do I care about what's coming
Yeah.
out of your mouth, right?
Sure.
So how do you
Yeah.
navigate?
Well, I think once again, if you can demonstrate from, let's just say from a financials perspective. So we go in and start doing the following data cleansing and data. We're able to save the company this amount of money. And all of a sudden we got approval for this part of our budget that affects our lives. Right. So repurposing that cost center to other projects within the organization, I think is a great way and a great motivator to build within an organization an ethos of, hey, you're going to see some benefits of it. Right. And certainly giving people the ability to be their own personal data stewards also engages them and shows them because, you start saying, well, do you want your personal information out on the, out for cyber criminals and you should get rid of this. And, you find out that when you start bringing it back and relating it to the individual themselves and how it can affect their life, not only just the organization's life, it becomes a much easier conversation. I think you've got more buy-in.
Yeah. So you mentioned NIST before as a
Hmm.
framework. I've had conversations with cybersecurity experts, and a lot of them caution that, leveraging these frameworks it's helpful, it's a tool, but not if you treat it as a check the box kind of approach, right?
Sure.
So
Sure.
in the context of data management, how would you encourage technology leaders that are listening to this to use those frameworks as a tool, but where do they need to go above and beyond?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We're all into checklists because it makes the job easier, right? I checked that box. I'm good, out of sight, out of mind. I think by once again tying those initiatives into reaching goals, and a part of those goals are, let's say if you have a cost savings, that some of that budget goes back and goes into other projects within the organization that people can benefit of. I think once again, building that ethos where you're reinforcing that, this is good for the company, but it's also good for you as a stakeholder within the organization. I think it's, building it by department, breaking it down into manageable areas that you can say, hey, if our department is able to show this kind of hygiene, we're able to represent this kind of savings. It gets shared within the organization, as far as the projects the department wants to work on.
There are regulations out there that, dictate how businesses can use data and how the people whose data it is that you're accessing are able to control their own data, right? And
Mhm.
specifically businesses in the US doing business in Europe have to comply with GDPR.
Right.
Almost everybody's going to have to comply with CCPA.
Hmm.
There's other state level regulations, right? So how
HIPAA, NYDFS,
yeah.
all of this. Yes.
So what do you like? How does a business manage all of this patchwork of regulations and requirements?
It, it's funny. I've looked at and I've talked to records managers going, back through the years, and it 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 really hasn't changed that much. The regulations are all built around, specifics about um, managing things in a thoughtful way. So I think, uh, once again, if you can show within the organization that you've taken steps to mitigate the risk, first of all, you're going to be way ahead of the game, especially from a litigation perspective. If you can show that you've followed a internal rule to help manage that data, it's going to reduce any kind of exposure from litigation. But you're still going to have, fines that are associated with if you're going to have, let's say, a release of personal information, let's say during a cyber attack, and you didn't have any controls in place, you're going to face fines. So I think it's a matter of just adhering to a couple of key things. And the key things are, number one, classification and putting a classification and identifying information that falls into that classification, right? So, this is personal information. It's got to be managed as personal information. And it could be big buckets. You're way better off just starting with big buckets, putting in place, making it enforced, than coming up with a taxonomy that's, 25 pages long that, oh, it falls under this regulation, this regulation, this regulation. You're better off managing it first at that level and saying, okay, what is the key or the longest pole in the tent? Okay, so to speak, from identifying, what is the worst case scenario. So once you do that and you manage that data, you're now taking that risk profile and made it way more manageable. So I always suggest to organizations, you know, you got to start somewhere. Don't try to boil the ocean. Break it down into chunks. Look and identify what are the key areas that are going to keep you up at night, and address those first, and then work on the rest afterwards. Because it is complex. I mean, when you get into all the rules and regulations, if you want to sit down and look at each rule and regulation in and of itself, it's like going through an ISO review. It's pretty detailed. Right. But I say, don't stop the process because it's too daunting. Pick your battles. Let's start organizing your data into the bigger buckets. And then there are ways of managing it through the process. Like if you have retention schedules and something's, you're not sure whether it's past a retention schedule, move it, what we call doing a soft delete. Move it into a protective environment where nobody has access into it. You can take the time and energy, but it's out of that attack surface and people don't have access to it.
Yeah, you take a crawl, run, or crawl, walk, run approach,
Yeah.
right? Don't just
Yeah.
sit on the sidelines because you can't do it perfectly. Paralysis by analysis is not going
Yeah.
to get you safe harbor if you do make a mistake, right? But you could at least show that there was intention there and that there were actions there. And this is maybe a turn in the conversation to the next topic, but what you don't want is for there to be some kind of a breach and for customers that are affected to find out that you were sitting on your hands and you didn't even make an attempt to protect their data, because that's a much different conversation than you did take the right steps, or at least the best steps that you could, and something still got through.
Right. There's, for example, from a litigation risk, let's talk about that. Getting rid of data. If you can go into a hearing and you got rid of data and they're saying you got rid of the data incorrectly, if you have a policy and you followed that policy and it was presented and that policy in and of itself is pretty good, but you might have been some data caught up in that. You are a much better position than if you have no policy and that happened. I can guarantee you can talk to any litigation lawyer that's going through it from a privacy and also from a you're going to have a much easier time of getting through that to the other side of much less damage to the organization.
Sure. And the turn that I wanted to make is to trust and board level conversations about data, right? Because being a marketing guy, and in particular, my background is branding, right? So I look at a lot of things through the lens of a brand, and brand equity is built on trust. Customers, your market, they need to be able to trust that the business is going to deliver on the promises that they make, and that they're going to that the product or the service is what they say it is, and the outcomes are going to be what they say it's going to be. And but they also need to trust that when something goes wrong and they call in, they're going to be supported. And if there's a problem or the business makes a mistake, they're going to make it right as best as they possibly can. And I think that what's unforgivable from a brand perspective, and really an existential risk in today's world, is if you betray their trust by not respecting their data and protecting their data, because everybody knows that there's a target on the back, air quotes, of the data, right? So that's one of the first things that I think a business really needs to look at is how are we going to deliver the best defenses possible to the data that we've collected from our customers.
Mhm. Yeah. No, you are a steward of their data. You act like one, right? So I completely agree with you. You're given the keys to the kingdom. And, many times you look at this information, if it gets in the wrong hands, you're really hurting people. So it makes sense right? You can't be paralyzed and not, continue the key functions of your business, because you're completely just frozen by the scale of the responsibility. But you can do what's reasonable. And what's reasonable is, once again, I'm saying, take care of the low hanging fruit first. Start a process. When you need more time to get through something, take actions that can really stop 95 or 99% of the issues and problems, and then work through it to take care of the rest of it. But doing nothing, sitting on your hands, you're not doing yourselves any favor.
So through that lens, how do you go about approaching this conversation to the rest of the C-suite, to the board of directors? How do you justify, because this is not sexy stuff, right? So if you're going to spend money, time, resources on something, I feel like a lot of times the board, the rest of the C-suite, they want it to be something that's going to be impactful and visible. And this is not. It's impactful, but it may not be visible. It's not revenue generating. It's risk mitigation, right? So
Shawn, it's funny you say that, because I can walk into a C-suite and talk to a CISO, and I said, "Hey, I just reduced your attack surface by 70%, your cyber attack surface. And oh, by the way, I saved you a bunch of money. And oh, by the way, I reduced your cyber insurance." Watch the response. That person, that persona is going to have a much different response than, let's say, somebody that's in, finance person will certainly appreciate the cost savings, but it's not. So you need to be, we put together assessment reports, and we've try to think of the different personas that are sitting in the room and go through it and highlight, from that data, what that data is telling me that might be relevant to them. So there are different ways of taking a look at what you're doing, but the folks that are really getting ahead and the folks that are really competitive are the ones that are understanding that, hey, A, my data is important, and B, that, proper management of that data as an asset is good for everybody within the organization. And and it starts at the top. So if you can get, somebody up at the CEO level, we've made levers out of some of them, going in, with some of our proposals and then walking them through it. So start a project, show some momentum. And what's key to it is, once again, doing that quick analysis and getting some low hanging fruit to show some progress within the problem early on. And once you do that, the projects typically build momentum, and you get core buy-in from the C-suite, because guess what? You're delivering on what you said quick. once again, trust.
Yeah, trust. Risk mitigation, I think, always resonates, but we've come a long way from, say, 2, 3 years ago when the conversation was the board saying we need AI, and the CIO is saying I don't know what that means. And now I think the board is still saying we need AI, but the CIO knows what that means and they probably know where they want to go with it, at least in some respects, right? They know where to start if they haven't already started, which I think most have. So the maturity has happened at the uh, on the enterprise side and maybe not on the board side. And I've read some data points, and I wish I could remember exactly where it was. I want to say it was something from McKinsey, but basically they were making the case that the board is still basically AI illiterate, right? In general.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so it needs to be kind of an education process. And so I'm starting to think of the we need AI conversation to be like AI is the destination. And there's two different ways that you can get there. The first way you can get there is by taking the surface streets that exist today. And that's the tactical approach. That's I'm going to pilot this, I'm going to buy this, we're going to start that. Or what you could do, and this takes a little bit more time and it takes a little bit more money and a little bit more resources, but you can start an infrastructure project where you build the superhighway to AI. And what has to go
Hmm.
into that superhighway is this type of project, data readiness, and it needs to be governance and it needs to be education. And it's all these not sexy foundational things that in themselves don't necessarily have an outcome and don't seem accretive to the business. But what it does is it enables you to get into the fast lane in the future with other projects.
Yeah, I think it's like anything else that we've gone through. When something's new and you don't have a lot of knowledge around it, what do you typically do? Well, you're the larger enterprises, you go out to a consulting firm to bring them in and have them take you through the project because supposedly they've got they've got some experience in doing these projects for other companies of your size and they understand what's required in that. For those companies that have gone through that and want to start taking it on itself, they obviously have had some history. They obviously have brought the right people in. They've identified a chief data scientist and somebody who works underneath the CIO that has been brought in strictly to handle that, and they're gonna manage that, and they're gonna build up the right team around the infrastructure and the right team around the tooling and the data management tools around it to go in. Or as I said, you do an outside consulting group that's going to come in and provide you with that expertise and that knowledge. So it's we're early on as far as the maturity of the marketplace in getting projects done more efficiently and up the route. There's a lot of stubbing the toes right now. So you're hearing, anecdotally, and also I think of some of the surveys that I'm seeing out there that, these projects aren't necessarily being successful early on. And so people are having second thoughts about it. The bottom line is, I think, the cat's out of the bag. It's inevitable. We're all moving towards a more AI requirement within an organization to be successful and competing, in today's marketplace. So I think it's inevitable. They're going to have your ups and downs, but I go back to, some really core basic ideas. I'll beat the drum until the cows come home. Bad data in, bad results out. So you're going to have to clean up the data. You're going to have some tools to do it. You're going to have some people that have to understand the data and what you're trying to do. It doesn't matter if you're doing large language models or you're using generative to agentic AI, especially on agentic AI, when you're essentially teaching the endpoints to be autonomous and understand it. You've got to train them right. So if you don't train them with the right data up front, you're asking for problems. So, it's just, I think, proves the point that you start off just understanding your data is the first step in any of these projects.
Yeah. And I think it's probably worth talking about what a right term, let's call it a data forward organization looks like, right? So if you're leading an IT department, what are the right headcounts to be hiring for to start this process and to manage this process? I know look, there's company like yours that can help with pieces of this, right? But there certainly
Mhm.
must be some level of internal ownership, right? So what does that look like, do you think?
Yeah, we Our company specializes in providing the tools to the folks that do it. So we work with some large consulting practices and things that come in there, and smaller, boutique shops, and it varies. Once again, the complexity of the situation, what the project is. There are very small, very easily defined, projects that have big payoffs that folks can implement, and there's other ones where they want to boil the ocean and it becomes, way more complex. But I think what I'm seeing and the results we're seeing early on is those projects that are focused in on, again, I keep using the term low hanging fruit, is taking a look at what processes that the organization does that are highly repeatable, highly understandable, that lend themselves to, we don't need to put people on this. We can put an AI into place and do this because it's completely scalable once you get it right to handle that process. So I think, and I've said that data scientists are really, I think, the key people that you have to focus in on. It. You're going to be staffing an organization. Get yourself a really good, and you want to be doing AI, get yourself a really good chief data scientist. They're the ones that are going to drive and help you put the right people in place to get the project done because they really are thinking the problem through on how to process that data.
In the cybersecurity space for years now, the story has been that there's more demand for people with that skill set than there are people that have that skill set. And so those people command a premium when it comes to salary and compensation package. But that's if you can even get them, right? So that's why, MSSPs are so valuable to an organization and they're, security partners.
Virtual data scientists. Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, my question is like, do you think that we're heading in that? Are we there now? Are we heading in that direction with data scientists?
I completely think that's the case. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. If you know, there are so many folks that that are trying to get into the, and even, not even at the large organizations, mid-sized companies that, certainly see an opportunity to leverage AI to bring value to it. So I would highly recommend that you take a look at consulting firms around and get a virtual data scientist to come in and handle a project. Sure. Yeah.
What about, seems like investing in the people that you already have may be a good strategy as well. And what I mean by that is, the promise or the threat, depending on your perspective of AI, is that it's going to make certain jobs redundant. And I think that extends in the IT department as well. And so most experts that I talk to, they don't advocate for replacing people necessarily, but augmenting people with AI. But
Mhm.
I wonder, is it a good strategy to look at the people in your department now and invest in their future and your future by giving them education and training in data science?
Well, I would argue that um, whatever your job is within an organization, if you're a manager, you're trying to do and understand the value of somebody within the organization. Investing in that talent is always, key to a company's long-term success, right? You build an ethos where, we're building a monster here that's going to be tough to compete against. So yes, I think that's true. And if, having an AI advantage is key, then to your organization and what you're looking to do in the future, absolutely. You want to keep a great bullpen out there that you can pull people in from, to fill in. So yes, building a bench, building a bullpen, absolutely. And I would argue that's the same in, whether it's data science and AI or whether it's design or whether it's not really different, right? You want to keep that bench moving.
Any predictions for the next 12, 18, 36 months when it comes to data and AI that you want to go on record and be held accountable for?
I think that, going through boom bust cycles within, there's inevitably going to be, you know, a slight pullback. I think it's going to be slight. I think, once again, the um, the advantages are just too huge that they don't overcome slight downturns in the marketplace. Nothing goes dramatically up on an old Wall Streeter, I can tell you that. So I think it's a little bit cyclical. But I think, 3 years from now, you ain't seen nothing yet as far as what AI is going to be doing. Um, yeah, you've got smart guys. I think Mark Cuban just said that 40-hour work week is out the door. That we're going to be working less and working smarter. But I'm a little hesitant to say get that bold out there. I just think that you're going to see continued progress within the marketplace as far as AI adoption. I think people are going to get smarter about what they're using it on and going back instead of trying to boil the ocean. They're going to start off with, those projects, that low hanging fruit, automating within a department, a specific process that's repeatable and working on those. And then as you grow and get more sophisticated within the organization, you can branch out. But I think AI is here to stay. Yeah. I highly recommend people that if you're not thinking about it, you really should think about it. And as you say, start planning for its implementation.
You know, I said earlier that we live in a data economy, and we do, but we also live in an attention economy. And guys like Cuban, traffic and attention, right? And so when they make those bold predictions, they almost never come true. It's all about getting the tweets and the clicks and all that. But since computers were invented, we've been saying the promise of computers and the internet was we would get time back. And we work more. It's just about an increase in productivity. So I don't think the 40-hour work week is going away unless it goes the other direction. But I do think we'll get more productivity squeezed out of the people that are putting those 40 hours in.
Oh yeah, I mean, let's face it. There is the goal of the company is to make returns for the investors and the stakeholders in the company. And obviously, if the alternative is to cut back on hours, so obviously, if you're going to do that, you're going to try to lower your costs from a cost perspective. So I agree with you. I was just making the comment because I consider Mark to be a pretty shrewd and smart businessman as far as, understanding what's going on within the marketplace. And he's believing that AI is here to stay and it's going to make a big, huge difference, whether it's, 40-hour work week or whatever. I'm just pointing to it more as an indicator that the belief in AI, as far as being a critical component of our go forward path here is businesses mature.
I certainly agree with you and Mark about that. Michael, is there some place that people can find you if they wanted to connect with you?
Yeah, I'm at Congruity360. My email address is msmith@congruity360.com. Feel free to drop me a line. Happy to talk to you a little bit about and introduce you to some of the things we've been working on.
Excellent. Michael Smith, thank you for your time and expertise. Appreciate it.
Shawn, have a good day.
You too.